Hey everybody, this is my 29-gallon miscellaneous tank. It's my oldest established tank. It's about 5 years old. Most of the community has been in there for the duration. There are a few new additions here and there along the way, but for the most part, the neons you see, the skirt tetras you see, the white cloud mountain minnows, the loaches on the bottom, and even the larger of the two angelfish have all been in this tank for about 5 years. I haven't re-scaped it. I haven't done anything to it really forever. This tank has just been sitting here ticking over like a clock. It is in need of a water change now, and it is in need of a little bit of tank maintenance. I did just add a rubber lip pleco, so I'm hoping some of this brown diatom algae gets eaten up naturally, and I'm not going to get in there and wipe the glass down. If you can see right here, that's that new rubber lip I just put in there. So we're going to see how this tank fares over the next couple of weeks with having a rubber lip in there to clean up some of that algae. But the real reason we're going to look at this tank is because I was reading some of the comments I got under one of my previous videos I shot recently about nitrates, and some people are talking about old tank syndrome. And so we're going to have a look at my oldest tank, and we're going to talk a little bit about old tank syndrome. I don't know a ton about it. I've looked into it a few times over the years just because I've had people suggest it when a fish dies, people just start throwing random things that they've heard out there. So old tank syndrome has popped up here and there, but I have never experienced anything remotely approaching what I would consider to be old tank syndrome. So apparently there's people out there that think old tank syndrome is nothing more than a slow accumulation of nitrates, and that eventually an older tank will have lots and lots of nitrates building up, and the water is so-called polluted, and then suddenly your tank crashes and your fish start dying and so on and so forth. That's not what old tank syndrome is. High nitrite levels are often associated with old tank syndrome, and that just kind of is by default. One of the things that causes old tank syndrome is neglect. And if you neglect the tank, your nitrates are going to build up. That doesn't mean the nitrates are the cause of the old tank syndrome. They are part of the problem, but that's the other issue with describing old tank syndrome as simply being a dirty tank that's been neglected for a long time. Simply by definition, anything that is a syndrome is a collection of symptoms or a collection of consistent conditions that make up the syndrome. So to say it's one thing is just fundamentally wrong. It can't be a syndrome if it is simply one thing going on with the tank. So what old tank syndrome really is, and most experts will still argue about this because nobody really can put their finger exactly on what it is, because it's a lot of different stuff. And some of it has to do with some things that I don't understand, but I'll get into in a little bit. Another one of the things that's very common in old tank syndrome is a pH crash. What happens is all of the mineral buffers you have in your tank are in there doing their thing. They're soaking up those excess hydrogen ions that are produced in the tank as a part of the nitrifying process. So during the process of the nitrates building up, you're also producing hydrogen ions. And your tank's buffer capacity, your carbonate hardness, is absorbing all of those additional hydrogen ions that are being produced. And at some point that buffer gets used up and your tank's water needs to be remineralized. The buffer is gone, and then suddenly your hydrogen ions start accumulating, and the higher that number goes, the lower your pH number goes. So eventually, in long neglected tanks, over time, as your mineral buffers are taken out of the water, you start having these slow, long declines in pH, and you can even have really sudden crashes in pH. When your pH starts getting low enough, it starts having an impact on your nitrogen cycle. The nitrifying bacteria can't really deal with the ammonia anymore, but by the time your tank is so acidic that the ammonia can't be dealt with anymore, it doesn't really matter because it's not ammonia anymore, it's now ammonium, and the tank looks stable and everything's fine, and then you get in there and you do a great big water change, and suddenly you've got a bunch of buffer in your tank again, your pH rockets up, and your fish all die because of a sudden pH spike. So that's a very common scenario that happens with an old tank syndrome. You wind up having a slow decline in pH, or you have a nitrogen cycle crash. The thing that I was going to touch on that I don't truly and fully understand, because I never took chemistry in high school, is the oxygen redox in the tank, and that also has to do with the mineralization of the water and the electrical conductivity of the water. I know that having electrically conductive water is important. You cannot use distilled water or pure water to keep fish in. It's not electrically conductive at all. It has zero electrolytes in it. So simply for the fish's nervous system, they have to have mineralized water. So that has something to do with it. After a long period of time, the water just sitting in the tank and staying in the tank eventually loses its electrical conductivity. Again, I don't understand all the mechanisms behind that, but that is also one of the aspects that has to do with old tank syndrome. That is one of the many conditions that have to be present in order for it to be considered old tank syndrome. Simply having a lot of nitrates in the tank, that condition already has a name. It's called having a lot of nitrates in the tank, or having excess nitrates. That's a single, simple condition. You have a lot of nitrates because you haven't done a water change in a while. That's not old tank syndrome. Old tank syndrome takes time. It's a slow buildup. It's a slow accumulation of something. It's a slow deterioration of others. And it comes from long periods of doing very little maintenance. You can do regular maintenance on a tank and still end up with old tank syndrome. If, let's say, you're doing a 10-gallon water change every week, or 10% water change every week, but that's all you ever do, and you do it regularly. Well, just using simple numbers, if you're building up 100 parts per million nitrates, but your water change is only removing 90, every week you're adding 10 more parts per million. And so week after week after week, while you're doing these water changes, you're still slowly increasing your nitrate level. You're slowly reducing your tank's buffering capacity. You're slowly making these changes because you're not changing the water out enough and often enough. So while my tanks do go fairly neglected, and this is why we're looking at this one specifically, this is my most neglected tank down here. Don't remember the last time I did a water change on it, but it's probably been a few weeks. I didn't bother to check the nitrates in the tank. I don't need to. I can already tell you it's going to be stop sign red. It always is. It always has been in this tank. I don't ever worry about it, which is all part of what got this whole series of conversations started. But I did decide to check my pH. I had somebody else comment that they noticed that some of my older tanks, and the ones I do water changes on less frequently, they seem to have lower pHs than my tap water. And that's true, they always do. And when I checked this tank, my pH was at 6.6, which is about where it normally sits. So that is not old tank syndrome, crashing pH down below 6. It's normal. It's where it always sits. My water coming out of my tap used to come out of my tap at 6.5. I adjusted it to bring it up to 7. So after a few weeks, having the pH drop down to 6.6 is no big deal. That's not old tank syndrome. The fact that I've got some nitrates building up in this tank is not old tank syndrome. And I don't know how long it takes for old tank syndrome to kick in, but it's been 5 years that this tank has been up and running, so if it's going to suddenly crash and all my fish are going to die, it better hurry up and get doing it pretty soon, or we're going to have to rename it like ancient tank syndrome. So I stand by what I said in my other video. I still want to talk more about the nitrates. I haven't heard anything that is going to make me change anything I said in my other video. I will clarify some things I said in my other video. But I don't feel like I put any bad or wrong or inaccurate information out there, so I don't really feel like I need to rush out and correct it because people are going to go out and kill their fish. If you actually listen to what I said in the video and actually paid attention to me, I never made any kind of indication that nitrates have no impact at all on your fish. I never said that. In fact, I said regularly throughout the video that you should still do water changes, that the nitrates building up in your tank are not a good thing for your fish. It's a good proxy to use, etc., etc. I think most people got the point of that video. I wasn't saying nitrates have no impact on your fish. I was simply saying you don't have to panic if you see 40 parts per million, and if you're new to fish keeping and you hear these people saying red is dead and these nitrates are going to kill your fish and so on and so forth. Don't listen to them. Your fish are not going to die overnight because you've got a little bit of nitrates building up in the tank. That's just not true, and I stand by that, and I stand by the other video I said. But like I said, when I get around to it, it's just, again, it's one of those things. I'm not in any hurry to get it done. I'll do it when I get around to feeling like doing it, and we'll talk more about this whole conversation about nitrates and tank maintenance and so on and so forth. And the one thing I really want to talk about is chasing perfection and chasing those perfect numbers and trying to get your pH exactly perfect and trying to get your hardness exactly perfect and so on and so forth. We're going to talk a little bit about that in an upcoming video, because more often than not, chasing perfection does more harm to your fish than simply leaving your tank well enough alone and letting the fish just get on with being fish. So make sure you're subscribed and you won't miss any of that. You won't miss anything else I got coming up. You never know what you're going to get with me. It could be anything from simple water change videos to these longer, more in-depth discussion videos. And if you're subscribed, you won't miss any of them. So don't forget, this one is my 29-gallon miscellaneous tank. It's my oldest tank, and it is not yet suffering from old tank syndrome despite being 5 years old. So thanks for watching. I'll see you real soon in the next one.